off. I think there's a few people joined now. It's quite a small group, so hopefully you guys, if you have any questions, we'll be able to cover them in the session, which we'll get through. So thanks so much for those that joined, and thanks again to Matt and Alex for agreeing to join this discussion today. It's one of the broadcast PRCA groups. I'm lucky enough to sit on the PRCA Council and chair the broadcast group, and part of that I get to arrange these discussions now and again, and hopefully line up guests and share insights which will be useful for PR and comms professionals, whether you're pitching stories or thinking about plans for clients this year or next. Hopefully there'll be some bits to take away. So yeah, thanks for those joining, and we'll get to it. Excuse me. I think the session is very much positioned as how do you get cut through with light or positive stories, primarily consumer stories, at a time when there seems to be so much bad news and doom and gloom around. I think looking out my window now, this grey weather seems appropriate for this conversation. And Matt, we couldn't think of anybody better than yourself to come on and talk about what it feels like to, I guess, wake up the fun every weekday, which is obviously how you position your breakfast show at Hits Radio with Fleur. So it'd be good to just get a bit of detail about yourself, the show, kind of what you do, and congratulations, by the way, on the recent radio results, which came out last week, which suggested you're almost at that 1 million listener mark on the breakfast show.
I mean, I've got to take full credit for that increase in listenership, of course, nothing to do with anyone else that I work with. No, it's well, I mean, kind of headlines of what we do. So Hits Radio formerly was a radio station called Key 103, which was like the big commercial radio station in Manchester. And then whether it was delusions of grandeur or wanting to just spread the word, it turned into Hits Radio. So at the time they had a digital radio station called The Hits. So to merge everything together, because basically the company owned loads of different stations that were playing the same type of music. So the intention was to just do one brand and put it out over the country. So that became Hits Radio. Wasn't necessarily a great success at the start, as networking radio often isn't. However, as you just mentioned, listener-wise, we're in a great position at the moment. A couple of years ago, I suppose the last few years merge into one, don't they? But 2021, we won silver in the ARIAs, which, for those people who aren't aware, is kind of the it's not the Oscars because it's not international, but it's kind of the big radio awards that the BBC and commercial radio all participate in. So we got silver in Breakfast Show of the Year behind Greg James at Radio 1. And then the following year, this year, I think it was in February or March, we won Station of the Year. So all these things have kind of come at the right time, really. So essentially we're a kind of national radio station, loosely aimed at 25 to 44-year-olds, slight skew probably towards women. We play pop music, slightly more maybe opinionated content, slightly edgier, for want of a less pretentious phrase, than your Capitals, your Heart, a little bit less slick and polished. And yeah, I'm on a breakfast show. I'm the executive producer and I'm on air as well. Everyone's kind of jack of all trades. Fleur East, who's on Strictly at the moment, is the main anchor alongside James Barr and me. And at the moment we work over 2 locations as well, which is difficult, but somehow we've made it work in this weird kind of post-COVID world where everyone started doing things differently, as I suppose this kind of chat has proven, because some things have stuck since COVID. So yeah, that's kind of Hits Radio in a slightly waffly nutshell.
No, that's great. Really useful, I think, summary for those people perhaps like myself who fall narrowly outside of your demographic target audience and therefore might not be as familiar with the output. I'm just too old, damn it.
Well, you're welcome to join. Believe me, we'll take anyone.
With that, I think again, a lot of breakfast shows, it's about historically it's been about getting people out of bed, getting them to work safely, awake, energized for the day ahead. So the tone is typically upbeat. The music is typically, energetic and upbeat as well. So I guess that the topic of today was very much looking at, well, how do you marry that with what's going on in the world? Like, there's a lot of bad news around at the moment. and that isn't a new thing. Obviously, during the pandemic, of course, a lot of broadcasters were kind of thinking about how do we align ourselves to the tone of what's actually being featured in news bulletins to make sure we're not tone deaf, but equally we know we have a role to play in lifting the spirits of our audiences. How do you grapple with that? Is it something you think about, or do you just very much disassociate yourself from the bulletins that are in news and therefore just do your bit to remain as upbeat and positive as possible?
No, you don't disassociate yourself from it in any way, and it filters through everything that you do. Every piece of content has to go through that filter of, are we going to alienate people? Are we going to annoy people by talking about stuff that isn't relevant to them? And at the moment, to be honest with you, I find that it's probably easier to get the mood right at the moment, because there is a shared experience, isn't there? If you think about the economic situation at the moment, I don't know. I mean, there'll be bankers, there'll be billionaires who aren't suffering, but 99% of the people who are listening to us, if not more, are struggling at the moment. So as soon as you target normal people, which we are doing, 25 to 44-year-old people who like pop music, I mean, that's quite a broad demographic. We're living it as well. So it's actually quite easy to talk about the day-to-day issues that people are having. Now, the struggle, if you want to call it a struggle, is taking that palette of shared experiences that everyone's going through at the moment and filtering it into content. And the content really is putting either a personal spin on it, or it's a little bit like observational comedy, where you're talking about yourself, but you're actually talking about the listener. So everything that you're saying, people go, oh, he's having the same issues as me, or they're going through what I'm going through at the moment. So of all the times that we've lived through, and we've lived through some weird times at the moment, I think at the moment, it's actually quite easy to get the tone right because everyone's going through the same things.
Yeah, it's a great point. I think that Mark Kermode talks about cinema as being a machine for creating empathy, and I've often nicked that line and not attributed it, but I should. But I think radio is a machine for creating empathy. I think it's such a personal medium that hearing people relate to the situation you're going through is one of the many reasons why it's such a powerful way of engaging with people. And I think just coming back to your point about not disassociating your content from news, I think there's a fairly famous example of that I actually don't know if you're aware of, but the Smiths track Panic was actually inspired by so that's Panic on the Streets of London, Panic on the Streets of Birmingham, Hang the DJ. I'm not going to sing it, but for those unfamiliar with it, the lyrics. But that
I know
was
a lot about the Smiths.
That was inspired by when Radio 1 Newsbeat covered news of the meltdown at Chernobyl back in the 80s. So very serious news story, and they talked about the potential threat of a radioactive cloud being blown over to the UK. Ended the news bulletin, and the DJ just played Wham's "I'm Your Man" without any kind of reference to what we'd just heard, which was pretty significant.
Well, there's a line in that song where he says, "It says nothing to me about my life," and that's a kind of, slightly Morrissey way of saying exactly that. Of as long as you understand your audience, and this doesn't just apply to radio, this applies to any business. And listen, I'm not a businessman, but you talk to any kind of successful entrepreneur and they will say the key to growing a business is understanding your audience. And the good thing about radio anyway is you can talk to your audience and you live amongst your audience. So it's not difficult to gauge the shared experience. And I'm always asking people when I'm on the school run, when you're having small talk with people, the issues that people bring up when they're chatting to you, they're the ones that you want to talk about on the radio. So that's kind of our role, really. And like I say, it's not tricky.
No, that makes a lot of sense. And I think that so the key thing is to make sure you're contextually relevant, but also it sounds like the media understands it has a role in lifting the nation's spirits appropriately, so not in a tone deaf or glib way. In fact, we at Markettiers did a bit of research a few weeks ago. We actually own a research business called Opinion Matters. So we did some research amongst radio listeners, and we found out that 86% want to hear more positive stories when they listen to the news, and that entertainment accurate news, and an uplifting feeling, the three things that they most want from radio during tough times. That's really interesting. Essentially 2 out of 3 of those are very positive, emotional reference points. So Alex, I'd like to bring you in now. You work obviously at Markettiers as a senior newsroom producer. Can you tell our audience a little bit about what that involves and perhaps what kind of stories you're maybe working on at the moment or have been working on recently?
Yeah, so my role is to speak to people like Matt, to try and, I guess, land some interviews on shows like the one Matt works on, but also, you know, other national breakfast shows on talk radio, you know, your LBC News, your BBC Breakfast, all sorts of broadcast media. My role is speaking to people like that on a daily basis, and it's pitching in those different stories, some that are potentially reflecting on the news, you know, like today's interest rates increase again, but also perhaps more fun stories, or even not necessarily fun, but more serious ones. We're working today on one with Jermaine Genius and Hugo Monet around men's mental health and Movember, which you may or may not have seen because it's sort of gone everywhere. But my background, I suppose I should just say, before I joined Markettiers, I was at Heart. I was a producer on Heart Breakfast for 15 years. So I very much fly the flag for fun and uplifting. I think that's probably going through with Heart, where they were turn up the feel good, I think was, if I remember rightly, the strap line when I was there. So especially on breakfast shows, I don't know, I think Matt would probably agree, you know, people wake up, the first thing they don't want to hear is necessarily doom and gloom, and it is the job of, I would say, breakfast shows to give that little bit of an uplift, but reflect what's going on. And to Matt's point, the producers and the presenters are going through the same things that the listeners are as well. So it can sometimes be tough to walk into that studio with a smile on your face every single day, no matter what is going on. But as long as I always felt like when we were in the studios, if you were laughing in the studios, there's a good chance your listeners are laughing along with you as well. But yeah, that's what I do at Markettiers. But like I say, I fly that flag for uplifting and entertaining.
Good man. And I think I kind of nodded to it at the start, and I think within the promotional copy for this event, but it feels to me like there were some lessons learned amongst communicators and the media in the pandemic, which is still being kind of deployed now, in as much as obviously it was such an extraordinary event that during those first few weeks, it was just news, whether it's national, local, what's going on, health related, lockdown related, etc. But then certainly it felt to me like the media was craving positive, uplifting stories, maybe 6 weeks, 2 months after that. And it feels like we're in a similar comparable state at the moment, where there's a lot of very serious negative news, as is often the way. And you know, there are social experiments to show that too much negative news is actually bad for your health, quite literally, physically and mentally. But it feels like the media now know actually they have a role to do in lifting the nation's spirits. Do you find that? Are you pitching those kind of uplifting stories which are landing well, or those kind of positive uplifting guests which are proving popular?
Absolutely. I think you get to the point, and in the comparison to the pandemic, I think you get to the point where you've all experienced it for what feels like forever, that the pandemic, the cost of living news, or what was COVID news, just became a regularity. And actually it was more people wanting to hear something a bit different. Yes, we know COVID cases are on the rise, or yes, for example, that interest rates are going up again and we're going to be in a recession for a long time. You almost know these things anyway, because it's been going on for a couple of months. So actually reflecting that, to Matt's point, because it's happening, you can't ignore it, but maybe talking about a bit more fun and a bit more uplifting. We've got we're pitching at the moment the EastEnders actor Jake Wood to do some bits. He is talking about getting the flu vaccine, but having someone like Jake do it, there's a slight more fun side to it, because he's just entered the age bracket of where he can now get that flu vaccine. So it makes it a bit more a funner conversation around how, you know, it is serious, get it because you should or you're eligible to, but actually he's now reached that age where you can have a bit of a fun debate about, oh, you get a bit older, Jake, and now you're getting your flu vaccine without having to book it and pay for it, and bits like that.
That's a good example. That's a good example. I think just as well, for those people who've kindly joined, again, thank you very much for doing so. If you have any questions, please feel free to pop them in the chat or come to those shortly, because we're going to keep this pretty super focused today. But Matt, before we do so, have you got any tips for PR professionals? Like, what do they get wrong? What do they get right? What kind of stories are you after? What kind of guests are you after? What are the things which really grip your
Well,
don't throw me under a bus here, man.
no. To be honest with you, Alex, like he mentioned, because he's a former breakfast show producer, he's got a great sense of what is likely to get on. And whilst I accept that he's got a job to do because it's in his interest to get guests on our show, so there's got to be that compromise. All I would say is, to be honest with you, the directive that I have as executive producer for this breakfast show is, when we get guests on, they have to be household names, broadly speaking. So if if most of the people in this presentation now hadn't heard of that person, then that would roughly be the gauge of whether they're worthy of coming on or not, regardless of what they're coming on to talk about, to be honest with you. And I know that sounds a little bit cutthroat and a little bit superficial, but the way we're marketed, and every radio station is different, our content is driven more by the name, and we bring them into our world. So people don't necessarily want to hear about what they're plugging or promoting, whilst we accept that that is part of the trade-off between us getting them as an interviewee and them being on the radio. But the idea from our point of view, from a selfish point of view, we get names that are instantly recognizable, that join our breakfast show and are kind of part of that, the feeling of the breakfast show. And as soon as people hear their voices or hear their name, they go, oh, that's great, they're on my radio station. So and I know that sounds a little bit brutal towards maybe the people who are probably really charismatic and really entertaining interviewees, but ultimately, if people haven't heard of them, we don't really want them on. I know that sounds horrible. But
how do you think, obviously Fleur, like you said, anchors your show, and she's currently still in Strictly, which, and she's done I'm a Celebrity. So, she's almost one of those recognizable names anyway. And with being on Strictly at the moment, that's only going to increase her profile and hopefully, your listenership. Right. But how do you think that affects your gauge as such of who because you have Fleur already?
Not massively, to be honest with you, because generally the guests, with the greatest of respect to Fleur, the guests that we got on are kind of usually bigger celebrities than Fleur. And I'm saying that, listen, I love Fleur, but everyone's there's a certain hierarchy, isn't there, of celebrity name, and she knows that. And we would target the people, over the past year, we have had on Adele, we've had on Pink, we've these kind of household names. Elton John was on the other week, people like that. So it's kind of, broadly speaking, I think we kind of target ITV primetime kind of names. So if someone would be a guest on like the Jonathan Ross show, they would be a guest on our show. Now I accept he's got a lot more viewers than we've got listeners. However, that's the standard that ideally you're hoping for. I mean, we get the odd dreadful.
Based on recent radar results, I'm not sure that's right, but there we go. But you're doing yourself a disservice.
It probably is.
Might have overinflated his viewership. Just again, for the benefit, maybe those guys that have joined in the audience today, aside from the guests and who you have on, how you have them on would be interesting. So are you now increasingly putting an emphasis on people coming into the studio, or are you still really happy with the remote? Or does the fact that, as you mentioned at the start, you and Fleur are typically in different studios these days, does that change things at all?
I mean, it's still not an ideal situation, but I think most people are over Zoom interviews now, not just from a convenience point of view, but face-to-face has been back for quite a while now, and the quality is so much better. I think over lockdown, it was almost a novelty. Everywhere you turned, every TV channel, every radio station, you just got used to that slightly glitchy, poor quality, tinny sound. But now we've got back to normal. And once you've had a few face-to-face studio interviews, which is so much better for many reasons, not just audio quality, just from interaction reasons. Because as we're speaking now, I mean, you can interact, but the interaction still isn't as organic as if you're face-to-face with someone. So the simple answer is, unless it was an absolutely huge star, we wouldn't do a Zoom interview now.
So if you were pitched, I think I know the answer, but I want to ask anyway. You pitched two guests. They're of the same caliber. Let's not say they're absolute superstar, for example.
Right.
One's in, and two, you get myself and perhaps another company pitch two guests. One says I can get them into your studio there in Manchester. The other one says it's Zoom and Zoom only. But perhaps is the better, perhaps the Zoom ones might be a more fun story, but the other one, you've actually got the guest in your studio. Would that top trumpet?
I mean,
it's a tough one. I know.
Possibly, depends who it was. Yeah. Elton John we did on Zoom, albeit his quality of Zoom, I don't know what Zoom access he's got, but his Zoom was like top-notch Zoom. He's clearly paying full subscription. But yeah, it would have to be someone of that quality who everyone knows lives in a different country, who's like an international star to get on Zoom now. I don't think we'd have like a domestic singer, a pop star in this country. I'd very much doubt it now.
I think that rings true from other broadcasters that we talk to. I think the people at Global and Your Heart and Capital like to get them now. Can they get to Leicester Square, to their main studios for their breakfast show? I think, to Matt's point, it's, we all got used to Zoom, but and FaceTime video or whatever it might be. But actually now there's no restrictions. You can go in and you can have that bit more fun with people if they're there next to you rather than just on a screen.
Just to interject slightly, an advantage of being over two sites as well, and this is trying to find a positive out of a negative, is because Fleur's based in London most of the time. You get bigger guests in London. The big Hollywood stars will come to London, whereas they don't come to Manchester unless it's a very, very rare occasion. So as a result, we've got better guests since she's been down there. And also at One Golden Square, where Fleur studio is, we have Kiss FM, we have Absolute, we have Magic. We've got these big brands. We've got Greatest Hits now. We've got these big brands. So there's more of an incentive from other PR companies, whether it's yours or other PR companies, to bring these stars, because they know they can tick off 4 or 5 different radio stations in one go. So it's actually it works out quite well for them as well as us.
It's like a press junket, or the very old-fashioned, radio tour, as it used to be called, which then is a phrase that's still used, but it just became the tour was using the technology, rather than literally moving around from studio to studio. That's really useful insight. Thanks, Matt. I think again, last prompt for questions, because we haven't had any as yet, in which case we can wrap this up shortly. But yeah, I guess Alex, for those kind of PR and communicators on this session today, any other observations, hints or tips in terms of the kind of things that your contacts are asking you for? We talked a lot about guests and a bit about stories. Like, do you think there is a lot of appetite for the kind of more traditional, very light-hearted, upbeat pre-Christmas stories? So if anyone is maybe...
you've mentioned the C word and we've only just got to November.
28 minutes, pretty good.
but yeah, I would say from conversations I've that Christmas is slowly becoming on the radar. I believe Capital might even be starting Christmas songs at 8 o'clock tomorrow, or certainly very, very soon. Whether you think that's too early or not, it feels like once Halloween's done, you see Christmas ramp up. But I think when it comes to Christmas stuff, Christmas is fun, whatever way you look at it. You can't put a downer on Christmas. Well, I like to think you can't put a downer on Christmas. I'm sure there'll be some people that would manage to, but people are looking at
the date and time for that jinx that you just delivered, Alex. Thanks a lot.
But I think some people will feel this year Christmas was missed for the last 2 years. Yes, last year we could gather a little bit. The year before was nothing at all. So you have to get that parallel between cost of living. Is there going to be less spent on presents and things like that? But actually also the celebration of Christmas and coming together. It's the first time for a couple of years we've really been able to have that fun and excitement. So I think I think absolutely, if you're not already, certainly start thinking of Christmas. Matt, I don't know if you started thinking Christmas yet for the show.
Yeah, well, a lot of our stuff is around. We do this Mission Christmas, which is kind of a charity campaign. So that's always our big concern over Christmas. But I mean, the Christmas music, I find a little bit of like all the, I don't know, I'm not a big fan of it myself because all the, well, no, just because all the stations try and compete. You know, you're saying Capital launching Christmas. It's like they launch their own Christmas stations in July. It's all a bit of a gimmick, really. And yeah, I think when the time's right, it's completely appropriate, and I think everyone has a role to play in getting everyone into the Christmas spirit. But one thing I would just say, just going back to a point that you said about advice to people in PR, just one thing which Alex isn't guilty of in any way, so I can say it in front of him. A lot of the time, people will offer a guest, so they'll email you with a guest, and you know straight away whether that guest is worthy of being on your radio station. I mean, I've been doing this for long enough to know pretty much straight away. Yeah. Sometimes there's a bit of a deliberation, but generally I'll know within a couple of seconds. And but on the emails, they tell you exactly why this person should be a guest on your show. And it's like, that never works. Because for a start, it's patronizing to the producer that you've sent it to. Yeah. And also, I mean, you just know what is worthy of a story. Yeah. And if someone doesn't reply, they're probably not replied because they're really rude people. They're probably not replied, A, because it's not right for them. Yeah. And B, because they're being inundated with like hundreds of emails. So so never take offense if you don't receive an email, but don't follow up with 12 different emails. That's all I'd say. Good advice, and also an excellent plea. In terms of questions, we've got a couple that have come in now. I think the first one's probably, Alex, you might be better placed to answer this one, purely because of the breadth of broadcasters that you speak to on a regular basis. Matt, if I'm wrong, please do jump in. But Holly's asked, if you don't have a celeb or a high profile guest, essentially if you've got a human interest story of broad interest, would that be of interest? And she said, for example, a social mobility or working class type story. So yeah, I think Alex, maybe if you want to come in on that one, like when and how do you see that working, or rather, who do you see that type of pitch working with?
Yeah, I mean, certainly, you know, don't need a celeb for every single story that you want to do. It just then ties down to that media that you want to go to. To tie into Matt and Hit, since he's got us with us, you know, he mentioned they have their Mission Christmas, which is their Cash for Kids charity that's national, where they'll have a lot of charity stories and the case studies, I suppose, that would be covered perhaps within their news bulletins and places like that. Whereas, I don't know, social mobility and working class stories, I think, you know, we know the BBC love those sorts of ones, and your regional BBC places that can film with perhaps a real personal working class story, a social mobility story that's in their area. And I think that brings it to life. I don't necessarily feel that you'll see it on hear it on Matt's Breakfast Show or the Heart Breakfast Show, who again, they have their charity arm as well of Globals Make Some Noise. So I think you certainly don't need a celeb. It's just pitching it to the right people. You know, I wouldn't necessarily pitch it to Matt if it was, like he said, if it wasn't a big sort of name for his show.
Yeah, I think that again, one of the key things to remember with broadcast is that both BBC and commercial local stations under their licensing agreement have to cover local stories. So if you have a celebratory case study of someone who's achieved something amazing in your area but isn't a big name, that's still going to be of interest if pitched the right way, so Matt's point, to that local BBC and commercial radio station, because they have to cover local stories. They want to, but also they're obliged to under their licensing agreement. Matt, did you want to come in on that one as well? We've got definitely got a question.
To be honest, I'd agree with it. We the only time we would ever have like a contributor that wasn't either a celebrity or a listener is if we were doing something quite niche, and there was like a little set piece almost, and we just needed someone to enhance that, or someone to be a specialist in a specific field. But generally, if there's a human interest story, that would sit in news bulletins or like Alex says, on local BBC, probably more suited to that.
Nice, brilliant. One question from Chris, and then we'll probably wrap things up. Thank you, Chris. Thank you, Holly, for your questions. Chris has asked a question for you, Matt. How do you feel about celebs trying to push brand messages? Does it feel authentic?
Yeah, well, Alex will probably have views on this, and it's a bit of a trade-off, to be honest with you, because PR companies, as a rule, and obviously you guys will know more about this than I do, but generally PR companies will have access to a celebrity when they are promoting a specific event, or they have been paid to be the spokesperson. Sorry, phone's calling, very unprofessional. Or when they've been paid to be a spokesperson for a specific brand. So that's how we do. We all know how it works. So someone like Alex might say, I've got this person available. They're talking about, I don't know, National Sausage Week, for want of a better national week. So the trade-off of that is, as long as Alex, as the person who's kind of the middleman, if you like, who's representing both the brand, the guest, and the client, understands that what we need to get out of that interview, then I think you can kind of compromise on something. So ideally, to be honest with you, we would not mention any brands whatsoever, because it just annoys our sales team if we mention a specific brand. And again, it's another way of just annoying people. So, but we appreciate that we've got the guest on, and we wouldn't have got the guest on otherwise. So it's the answer to the question from Chris is, it's kind of part of the package that they will push that. Some celebrities come on and don't actually want to push it that much, in which case it makes it really easy. I think we will always mention it if asked to, is the answer.
I think I would jump in as well, and we always discuss this when we're thinking of different campaigns that people want to do. And when it comes to authenticity, it's not just, and if you want to go with the celeb route, don't just pick them out of a hat. If they can have a genuine sort of connection to that narrative you're trying to get, it makes it a lot more easier and a lot more authentic, rather than just, here's Elton John, who's been paid to say whatever.
I think the word there we're looking for is relevancy, isn't it? Like if you want somebody to be, if you want a mention to be authentic, then the campaign ambassador, spokesperson, and there is actually a difference, needs to be relevant to the topic. So if it sounds like the branding's crowbarred in, then everyone, the listeners are going to hear that as well, and it's actually potentially going to have, rather than a halo effect for the brand, it could, in a worst case scenario, have that kind of devil horns effect where you're like, oh, I didn't, that sounded uncomfortable. So I think our role as PRs isn't just create the opportunity by, paying somebody to mention your brand. It's then doing the graft in between. So the graft up front, make sure they're relevant for the story, but then also make sure you coach them and help them to be able to deliver that messaging in a really editorially balanced and natural way. Otherwise, just getting the brand mention on there might be seen as a success on a quantitative report, but if you qualitatively look at it and evaluate how effective that was, it's going to fall down. So I'd say there's always, getting the opportunity is one thing, but making the opportunity work for the broadcaster as well as the audience is absolutely crucial there. I think in that case, we'll wrap it up. That was really, the 40 minutes absolutely flew by. Chris, Holly, thanks so much for your questions. Thank you everybody else who joined for your time and attention. Massive thank you to Matt for taking time out of your day to share some of your insights and experiences. Really appreciate it, mate. Hopefully you're not going to get in trouble.
Sorry, I went on under a fake name on my Zoom.
It's a great name. It's a great name.
Thank you, Alpha. Beta Alex as well for joining to share the view from marketers. Really appreciate everybody's time. If anybody has any questions after this around this topic, feel free to get in touch with myself or Alex. But yeah, thanks again, everybody, and see you again soon, hopefully. Bye-bye.
Yes, thanks, everyone.
Thank you.